Perfect. Welcome to this session on how can we mitigate the risk of a quantum winter. We've only got half an hour to cover a rather large topic and a good number of speakers, so we're going to dive right into it. I mean, essentially, we'll divide the subject into two halves. First of all, how much risk is there of a quantum winter? Is it a sort of a kind of journalistic trope, or is it real? Is there a real risk? And then we'll, of course, discuss what are the best ways in which to mitigate that risk. And we really do have a fantastic set of panelists here to discuss that. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Michael Cuthbert, who is Director of the UK National Quantum Computing Centre, Stuart Woods, who is Chief Operating Officer of Quantum Exponential, which is an investment firm in quantum firms, Deborah Berabiches, who is CEO and founder of Solve4U, and Alex Challens, who is co-founder and CEO of the Quantum Insider, which I'm sure you are all reading regularly. So the first question I'd like to put to you, Michael, is sort of what evidence do you see of this so-called quantum winter? Generally, it's a fairly cold technology. So does that extend to the outlook?
So I think I would start off saying I'm really not a fan of this term, the quantum winter. That said, we all know, regardless of the quantum technology aspects, for any deep tech firm right now, these are challenging times. There's global uncertainty, supply chain challenges, the cost of borrowing is going up on a regular basis. So I think, yes, indeed, there is a risk for ongoing investment, but I think this is a challenge we're all seeing rather than it being something aligned to quantum. Being an early technology, perhaps we feel a little more vulnerable, a little more at risk, but I think if you were to have the same panel discussion with people in other aspects of deep tech, I think they would be feeling the same thing. In terms of evidence, we still see ongoing significant commitment from governments around the world in terms of not just short-term spending, but long-term spending commitments. I think some of the startups are finding it more challenging for follow-on funding, perhaps not seed funding, but for more significant levels. I think there is a challenge around genuine scale-up funding. We've already seen perhaps one or two market failures. I think there's been evidence that many of the SPAC investment deals were probably too early. But faced with such a large pot of cash, why wouldn't people go forward and take up those opportunities? And then I think the other factor is inevitably, as we've just been hearing a little bit about, is the firestorm surrounding AI right now and the tension in the media that may well start to drag resources in large companies away from quantum and some of the horizon scanning into more immediate technology questions around AI, and given that many of the knowledgeable and capable people within those large organizations are straddling the two technologies.
So even though you don't like the term quantum winter, you definitely see evidence of something that we should pay attention to.
There's evidence of greater challenge and scrutiny. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but we are going to need to justify our investment efforts ever more seriously as time goes on.
So you'd be happy with the word frost?
I'll give you that.
Okay.
And all such puns are allowed all through this panel. Keep them coming. Last year I had Tony Utley, the Quantinuum CEO, on my panel, and I think he set two sort of definitions for there being a full winter, which is if a big quantum computing company stopped investing, and if you saw kind of progress, technological progress across the industry stalling. Alex, would you share with us, do you see either of those conditions being fulfilled, or definitely not?
I think we can already see in terms of technological progress, there's been huge amounts even over the last 2 weeks. You mentioned Quantinuum. There's a fantastic paper that came out last week. Look, and to Michael's point, that there has been challenges in the capital markets, but we should remember that when we're looking at people, some organizations that are starting to struggle on the capital markets, we should remember that as a natural part of deep tech capitalism. And to imply a quantum winter implies a quantum summer, that there really wasn't one. What we saw last year was a very unique moment where you had a load of things that came together which allowed certain companies to IPO and certain very large funding rounds. Just because that happened in that particular environment doesn't mean that when we are starting to see, and I can give you the data in a second, a slight slowdown, that we should be massively panicking. The research underpinning everything is still going very nicely.
And what is the narrative like? I mean, do you think there's a softening in perhaps what was a little bit overhyped in terms of predictions of what quantum technology can do in future? Deborah, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I'm a bit more of a skeptic, I guess, than the rest of the people on the panel. And I do fear the consequences of the overhype that the media has gone in quantum. When I did my PhD in physics, I had a Nobel Prize winning advisor who won the prize for the fractional quantum Hall effect. And he continues to be extremely skeptical about quantum computing. And at the time, this is 20 years ago, we would define quantum advantage or quantum supremacy, I don't like that word, but as a fault-tolerant universal quantum computer that would serve multi-purposes, not just one thing. My concern is that I've seen, even last year at this conference, I've seen the goalpost move around a lot in the last 20 years, meaning what we now consider quantum advantage is a lot different now than what we were hoping for in the past. Now it's almost a semantic thing, but people are saying quantum advantage, we've arrived at it, we've achieved it because we have a one purpose, several qubits, working to do something slightly better than a classical computer. That's not exactly what we were looking for, in the beginning. And so for me, that's a sign that our hopes may be a little bit too inflated. Just last year, I was on a panel where the people, prominent people in the field, were promising quantum for climate change, quantum for biotech in 12 months. And here we are, and none of that is happening. So I caution people. My consultancy advises governments and other medium-sized companies on what strategy and what path to take to get involved in quantum. And many times the answer is, it's not yet right for you, and because I have to be honest, and so I respectfully think that things are not, they are progressing, but not in the direction that we were talking about a few years ago.
Is it possible to see that sort of technological milestones aren't being met in the past few years? I mean, are there particular examples or a trend, or is it moving?
I mean, I would say yes. Like even IBM's Osprey 433 qubits is amazing, right? Everybody's lauding it, but we still don't have measurements for all the quantum computers to compare qubits with apples with oranges, right? Like nobody agrees on volume, on fidelity, or what are the measurements. So we don't even know. And people are saying we need hundreds of thousands, if not millions of qubits to actually achieve quantum advantage. And so even that great milestone, which took a lot of technical groundwork, hasn't yet given us enough fruits in terms of applications and advancement in end user Thanks.
And Michael, in terms of revenue coming out of the industry, and I think you think that it's very important to to see that grow sort of apace with the amount of investment going in. Is that happening, or is that also a disappointment? So we've talked about money in terms of funding.
Yep.
We've talked about sort of technology, had the progress on the technology and moving towards a full quantum computer. But what about revenue coming out, sort of commercial use cases? Do you see that coming through?
So I think there are some early signs, but it is really pretty small compared to the levels of investment. And how much of it is a really quantum compute as a service compared to some of the kind of associated consulting services that are supporting businesses understanding the opportunities in quantum computing, perhaps exploring use cases, regardless of the infrastructure or the platforms to run algorithms that would really explore some of the pharmaceutical applications.
Yeah.
I think large-scale applications for the future. So I think revenue is a challenge for the whole quantum sector. And as I mentioned earlier, the kind of, seeking investment becomes more challenging. Investors are going to be scrutinizing where is the revenue ever more so. And so I think that is something that, as a wider ecosystem, we got to be, aware of.
Sure.
To come back to just a quick point you made, I recognize what you mentioned of the goalposts continually moving. Mm-hmm. To some extent, I wouldn't get too disheartened by that, because I actually think that's because we're learning what it's going to take and the overheads associated with error correction and some of the infrastructure, that perhaps the goalpost moving is because we're figuring out what it's really going to take for error corrected machines, and that some of the more pessimistic view of millions or tens of millions of qubits, maybe we're a little closer than we thought 20 years ago, or even just a few years ago.
Oh, it's true. I like Alain Aspect from Pascal, who won the Nobel Prize last year. He got up at Q2B at this conference 2 weeks ago and said, "We physicists are not magicians," kind of saying like it's incredibly hard engineering-wise to scale qubits and the use of qubits. So you're right. We're moving the goalpost because we're realizing that the physics is there, but the technology and the engineering of these machines is incredibly challenging.
Yep.
Alex, I do believe you're somewhat more optimistic, and there's a sense in which, if there's a bit of a winter, so what? We're talking about sort of long tech arcs that last for many years. So does it really matter? And shouldn't you just plow on and believe?
Well, yeah, look, physicists and indeed all humans are really quite poor at predicting the future. And so I think we need to be humble that we shouldn't be overhyping it, but also humble that all the kind of technological advances that are happening in the background are, quite encouraging. I'd also like to kind of build on maybe the last panel as well around government involvement. Let's just remember that when we were looking at transistor in the 1970s, the first customer was the US government for missiles, and it was certainly not an enterprise grade, massively scaled revenue generator. And look what's happened to transistors. Yeah. I don't want to, just to level set, we are not quite there yet. I really don't think we're there, but we are starting to see revenue. And I'd actually love to pass it over to Stuart, who's probably close to where we're seeing that.
Well, I can think back to 2002. I couldn't get 1 gigabyte of broadband to my home in Plano, Texas. Right now, I think most of us everywhere here, or even in the US, can get 1 gigabyte of broadband to your home for £50. Right? That wasn't that long ago. I was able to see the amount of fiber installed when I worked at Pirelli and then Cisco in the short amount of time, and how much the telecom boom changed. We moved from how many dog food companies could you have to can we all have broadband, in a matter of 5 years. I think we are at setup, you can only judge the rate of change that you're living through by looking backwards, right? Part of our problem is that we're looking at a cliff face. I think, Michael, you would probably agree with me. There's a lot of challenges. We're climbing a cliff, but we only know it's a cliff because we're looking backwards. And I think that's part of what is how we have to think about quantum is that each incremental change is a bit of a climb. It's very difficult. But I think, when we wake up, 5 years, 10 years, I think we're going to actually see how much we've learned.
Fantastic. And your firm breaks the industry down. I mean, it's necessary to get into a bit of detail
Yes.
if you're talking
Yeah.
about winter. So you identify 11 sectors. I won't go through them all, but they're obvious: computers, software, cryptography, post-quantum era encryption, quantum and AI for chemistry. But so a whole load of sectors. Where could the winter kind of bite hardest? Where does it?
I think my biggest concern is anything that's called quantum inspired. I always see, that's you get a little bit of that all the way through from hardware to software to applications, and I think what do we not want to have happen? It's this whole point of we want quantum to be exactly what it is, whether it's a sensor, whether it's computing, whether it's an application. When we start to get muddy and we get lost in quantum inspired or synthetic data or we're not able to understand our success, right? To your point, we can't measure. And I think when we start to get into situations where we can't measure success, then we can't understand shareholder value. And that's really where I start to get concerned. And I think as long as we start understanding and quantum exponential, we're only a quantum tech investor. So we don't look at deep tech, we don't look at AI, because we have to have an understanding of the technology in order to assure to our shareholders that we're investing properly. And I think it's really, winters will come when we start muddying the waters and we're not determining what is what.
So quantum computing probably it's chilliest.
I think anything that starts to be slightly inspired, right, is concerning. Quantum computing, there are different flavors. I mean, Michael knows, we can get into the debates. There's multiple flavors of quantum computing. I think that, Michael, as you sort of hinted at, there are certain verticals that are very deep that are more applicable to certain types of quantum computers than others. And I think we will start to see those fleshed out over time quite quickly. Peter and Richard were talking about one particular activity, but I think, the problem is if we don't understand, again, those verticals and those applications and how narrow they are, then we run the risk of creating a winter within computing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do work for a communications firm, and so I think it's fascinating to think about how this industry has been telling its story. Has it been doing a good job of sort of telling inspiring stories and making clear the sort of relevance to the broader public and to broader companies? I'd like to pose that one to you, Michael.
So I think my sense is that the kind of quantum ecosystem has been really outstanding at talking to itself. And I think there is a risk, and there's some evidence of this, that when talking to the general public, it immediately becomes science fiction. There's work to be done in bridging that gap. There are lots of knowledgeable people working in the media, in the communications industry, who are helping us with that journey. I think we will all benefit from a really tangible use case that we can communicate. I think talking in generalizations about large sectors like energy, like climate change, like pharmaceuticals. So we all know those are important, and they engage, public are engaged in those topics, but nobody has a clue what classical computing is used in those industries right now. So how on earth is anybody going to immediately grasp what a quantum computer will do? So I think we will really benefit from specific and inspiring and intelligible use cases.
Yeah, and ones that are not computing based.
Absolutely. So the metrics and benchmarks that we can describe how a quantum computer is doing something new, different, and better than classical computer.
Yes.
We need a metric that isn't in the depth of computing science. That is important,
Yeah.
that we understand what's going on, but in the communication and the language we use, we have to use language that engages and inspires.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you said. I'm actually in the process of writing a book for middle school students, because I believe they are the generation that are really going to take advantage of quantum. And I do think we've done a disservice by focusing on explaining too much about these very quantitative and weird details of quantum physics, forgetting that the end user doesn't care about any of that. And we are in deep need of a quick, big success story.
Yep.
Even in this conference, most of us are in the technical side. There are very few presenters who are on the end user. Like, I've used it and I reduced my computation time by this much. I compared it to my HPC boosting, and this is what happened. And the sooner that we get those, the more we can prevent a winter in terms of shareholder value decreasing, because we just don't see where this is going.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I want to focus just more on the mitigation side for perhaps another 4 or 5 minutes, and then it'd be fantastic to gather some questions from the audience. If you would sort of start thinking of them now, really want to have some questions that are deeply techie and really hard, preferably. So on the mitigation side, I mean, it seems as if the part of that is already in place, which is the enormous enthusiasm of governments to step in and really invest, perhaps as much for geopolitical and kind of industrial policy type reasons than sort of revenue and use cases, dare I suggest. So, I mean, question for you, is there a risk of distortion here when there's so much investment coming from governments rather than perhaps the market and from private shareholders? So in particular, the UK, Michael, 2.5 billion has now gone in, and you've had obviously this amazing announcement in the budget, really substantial quantum investment here, and you're also seeing it in Germany, I think. What is this sort of just? Is there no issue here, or do you think the private sector will step back in? And Alex, I really want to hear from you on that as well.
So I think there's always a risk that people see a large number and say, the government's got it, we can step back. I think what we often talk about the £1 billion UK national programme of the 10 years that we're in year 9 of. So 20% of that is privately funded. So it's 80% government funded, 20% privately funded. And that doesn't include the in round numbers between 650 and 750 million raised in venture capital invested into our startups. So there's already significant private investment in the UK ecosystem that has been very well supported, seeded and initiated by the government. So the fact that government is now raising its ambition, having a 10-year programme and committing to significant further investment, I think is the clarion cry to the kind of investment community to say, this is important, this is a priority, there's something here, and it's setting the direction rather than saying, we're going to do it for you.
Alex, would you agree it's the biggest bit of mitigation?
Yeah, I think so. We like to have this view that the Elon Musks of the world independently went out and decided one day to raise lots of money and build things independently, and we kind of forget the importance of government in underpinning that. Let's go back. Nuclear, building a nuclear industry in the US, then the electric cars, then even sending rockets to space. It's like all of that has been backed by governments. I don't think that we need to have any kind of capitalist concern around the government stepping in too much and treading on toes. We have a very clear gap in the financing system in the US as well, but massively in Europe, where we try to get from the seed investment where everyone's very excited to the Series A and beyond. That is a very important part for government to play a role and take those long-term risks that the venture investors, as much as they're big risk takers, are not willing to take.
Yeah.
Deborah, I'd love to hear a bit more from you about the idea you have around standardization of metrics to kind of chart progress, because I think that's really, really interesting and important. Does anything like that exist now or not
Thank
at all?
you. No. So, like, for example, it doesn't exist yet. People have been trying.
Can you give us some examples of how it's
Sure.
not like
I
stuff
think-
that isn't comparable?
Yeah, so NIST is the Institute of Standard Metrics in the U.S., and what they do is basically they create technologies. It's not like they define the meter or the second, but they create a technology that people can use to measure things, measure time, measure weight, and of course, many complex technologies. That gets branched out into ethics and applications, and I don't see a consortium yet, even in the European consortium, that is advanced enough in trying to create a metric that defines what's going on in quantum, and we need it for servicing the industry, for pricing, for a lot of things. It's super important. IonQ tried a few years ago creating a measure called volume that they define in a certain way, but it didn't have adoption, and people were like, no, that's too IonQ centric. And so I would love to see perhaps in Europe a global consortium of people that are working on that on par with the technological progress, so that we can actually arrive at a good definition of what quantum advantage.
Michael, is that a good idea?
Absolutely. We've got a program actually we initiated with National Physical Laboratory in the UK to start to look at exactly that. So what are the open standards that we can make comparisons that are perhaps algorithm specific across different modalities, because quantum volume is good for some and not good for others.
Exactly. Yes.
And that we, along with other similar national institutes, can really be those trusted authorities, that trusted voice to make cross comparisons with different companies, different modalities, different platforms. That at the moment is quite difficult to make those comparisons.
Great. Any questions from our audience? Here, the lady in the front row.
Hi, so my name is Hani. I'm from IBM, Quantum, senior scientist. So thank you for all the panel. And I guess I have a quick comment we do have a decent metrics actually developed in academia, and then quantum volume is actually adopted quite a bit of the different, the hardware vendors, and developed by IBM, by the way. And then I personally think that metric is actually more important to develop the quantum supply chain, because, like if you want to build the hardware, the standardization is actually a little more about, if you want to exchange different parts, if you connect different industries, that's what you need, a standardization, right? So I think maybe that's the direction that we probably have to go. And then I think in the US, QEDC is actually leading that discussions at the moment. I feel like it's a little bit early yet to define the standardization, but I'm hoping that in the next few years we can do that. And then actually question part is I personally think that I'm at IBM, and then I see our development. We have a development roadmap that we are hitting every single milestone. We did the 33 qubits last year. We're gonna do 1,000 qubits this year. But then, I don't really see that, a lot of narratives of our technology development is not really, transferring to the public. And then I think the public awareness is very important to reduce the hype, and then also bring the private money there, because you have to have a better understanding of the quantum computing to bring money, invest, and then reduce the hype. So I don't know what would be the best way to increase the public awareness. And I think that that's the best way to also mitigate the quantum winter. But I don't know what you guys think about that part.
Stuart, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. I guess the first thing I think about is that quantum technology is just not quantum computing, right? I mean, I think there's a whole host around activities around quantum sensing and quantum timing that we need to come to grips with. We can't continue, I think one of the talks earlier, we can't continue to actually rely on satellites to do timing, right? We can relate to that. I go to an ATM machine, or I go to E-Trade, I do a financial transaction, and I'm taking time from a satellite that might get denied, okay? one day the public's going to wake up and they're not going to know what time it is, and they're going to actually figure out maybe they need a quantum clock, right? It does need standards, and we need to figure out how to interpret it. I think at the other time, you start to look at the climate change and the impact that it has on groundwater or subsidence or sinkholes. This all screams of the need for additional sensors around looking at changes of mass in the physical crust of the Earth. That is a gravitometer, a quantum gravitometer, and sensors like that start to see climate change and physical change in mass, which the public can relate to. I think the fundamental way that we move out of the quantum winter and into something that's a little more grounded in reality is to start thinking about sensors and timing and other aspects, and broadening the conversation with the public beyond just computing.
Yeah, telling people that an MRI is quantum sensing. And
Well, I think the other way to think about it is that, what's cold, right? What is cold? I mean, we think, we feel it.
absence of movement.
Yeah, absence of movement, right? You have an atom that stops moving. Complete stillness is cold. I think that kind of concept, is really hard to translate. But the ability to know that anything that interferes with that, I think, can start to impact on how we sense the world.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm afraid we are out of time, sadly. I'd love to have had more questions, but I hope you've enjoyed the panel. We hopefully covered quite a bit. For me, the main points are that there is a winter feeling at the moment. The point you made, Michael, about the investment being so much bigger than the revenue is quite concerning. There's a need for greater standardization, public awareness, but the kind of safety net seems to be governments and the public sector. So I think if there is a winter, it's not terrifically severe and risky to the path of technology as it goes forward. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening, everyone.